Ever put your faith in someone, really trusted them, and then had it all blow up in your face?
Yeah, sadly, it happens more than we'd like to think.
It's just like devastating, you know?
Absolutely.
That's what we're looking at today, a story about a youth pastor named Nick Hackney.
At Christ Community Church out in Seattle.
Right. And this church, they were what you call charismatic, right?
Yeah, so charismatic churches, they tend to emphasize what they call signs and wonders.
Signs and wonders. Okay.
Things like speaking in tongues, faith healings, believing they can see the future,
Ah,
creates a very emotionally charged atmosphere.
I bet. So people going through a rough patch, maybe they're looking for, I don't know, some kind of miracle.
Exactly, looking for something extraordinary, and that's where Nick Hackney comes in.
Okay.
So he was a youth pastor, seemed really devoted, but then tragedy struck.
His wife, Dawn.
Yeah, right. Dawn died in a fire.
Awful.
Just awful. And naturally, the whole congregation rallied around him, offering support.
Especially, I imagine, the women in the church may be looking for comfort, guidance.
Exactly. Women like Annette Anderson.
Right. Annette, she was married, went to Nick for counseling after a loss of her own.
And it's just, well, the way he convinced her their affair was God's plan, it's chilling.
It's scary. How does someone twist faith like that?
It's spiritual abuse, plain and simple.
Abuse.
Abusers, they exploit trust, they use religion to justify their actions, control their victims.
So, Annette, she thought she was doing the right thing.
He made her believe it, even with all the guilt she felt.
It just gets worse, though, right? He was also involved with Sandy Glass,
Church secretary, yeah.
who was also, hold on, a prophetess.
Yeah.
And he recommended her to Annette as a friend.
Mind-blowing, isn't it? It shows you how deep his deception ran.
Let's back up a bit. Tell me about Sandy, what made her so influential in the church.
Well, people saw her as a vessel for, pronouncements from God, someone who could see the future.
And people took that seriously.
Oh, absolutely. Her predictions carried a lot of weight, even with the church leadership.
So what, people made big decisions based on what she said?
There was this one time she predicted a massive earthquake.
An earthquake, wow.
Church leaders, they took it to heart, told everyone to stockpile supplies, prepare for the worst.
So what happened? Seattle got hit by an earthquake?
No, it never came.
Never happened.
But it shows you the power of belief, how easily people can be influenced, especially in a faith setting.
You really got to think for yourself, even when it comes to faith.
No doubt about it.
But back to Nick.
Mm-hmm.
There were other women too, right? Besides Annette and Sandy.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there was Nicole Matt, also a member of the church.
And he was after Lindsay Smith?
Pastor Bob Smith's daughter, no less. Sent her emails while she was on a mission trip to South Africa.
The pastor's daughter. Unbelievable.
And as if that weren't enough, there's Diana Parmalee,
Who's that?
his deceased wife's mother.
He was involved with his mother-in-law.
Diana was heartbroken, vulnerable after her daughter's death.
So he took advantage of her.
He used her grief to get close to her.
How could he do that?
Diana, looking back, she regrets it all. The guilt, the impact on her family, everything.
This guy, he was a master manipulator.
Yeah, no question.
And this was all while he was still married to Dawn. Were there any clues, like, before her death?
Well, there are rumors, especially about him and Sandy.
Really?
Pastor Robert Biley, he even confronted Nick about it.
So people knew something was up.
But it's a church, right? Trust is a big deal.
So they maybe didn't want to believe it.
Maybe. Plus, there's the whole thing about protecting the church's reputation.
I guess blind faith can be dangerous sometimes.
It can make you vulnerable.
Just like you said, got to question things, even in a faith setting.
Absolutely.
This is just crazy.
Yeah.
But there's still the big question, the one hanging over all of this.
Mm.
Was Nick responsible for his wife's death?
That's what we'll be diving into next time, the investigation that was reopened thanks to one woman's bravery.
This is just wild. Can't wait to hear more.
Back again, picking up where we left off with Nick Hackney and Christ Community Church.
So last time, we found out it was Sandy Glass, the church prophetess, who went to the police.
4 years after Dawn's death, can you imagine?
What made her finally speak up after all that time?
I think the guilt was eating away at her, knowing about Nick's affairs, her own involvement,
Must have been a tough decision going against the church like that.
especially in a place where her word was basically law.
Did the cops even take her seriously? I mean, they'd already closed the case.
They were skeptical at first, naturally.
Makes sense. They thought it was an accident, right?
Yeah, a fire in the bedroom, tragic but accidental. But what Sandy said about Nick, it painted a different picture.
So, like, what did she actually tell them?
About Nick's state of mind before Dawn died, the affairs he was having, the resentment.
It's like she gave them a motive.
Exactly. Now, it wasn't just a sad accident. Maybe there was something more going on.
And did they find anything suspicious when they looked back at the fire?
They noticed some things they'd missed before, like where the fire started.
Under the bed.
Yeah, Dawn's side of the bed, not near any outlets or anything.
That's pretty weird. Did that lead to charges right away?
Not so fast. Remember, this is a church people loved and trusted Nick.
Hard to accept those accusations against someone you look up to.
Some folks even thought it was a smear campaign or some kind of spiritual attack.
So the police had a lot to untangle. Did they find any hard proof to back up what Sandy said?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Sandy admitted that some of her prophecies, they weren't, well, divine.
What do you mean?
Nick was feeding her information, things to say as if they were visions from God.
He was using her.
It seems like it, yeah. He realized how much sway she had over the congregation.
So he was pulling the strings, manipulating everyone.
Controlling the narrative, yeah. Maybe even trying to cover his own tracks.
That's messed up. Did people believe Sandy after that?
It definitely hurt her credibility. People felt betrayed, realized they'd been fooled.
This whole thing, it's like one big mess.
And it gets even worse. This investigation wasn't just about Nick's affairs, it was about the whole system, how easily people can be misled.
So the million-dollar question was Nick responsible for Dawn's death?
That's what everyone wanted to know. They had suspicions, but did it add up to murder?
Tough to prove something like that, years after the fact.
They had to go over everything, look for the tiniest clue, any inconsistency.
Like solving a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
And obscured by faith and lies and conflicting stories. Did they finally crack the case? That's what we'll find out next time.
We're back, still digging into the story of Nick Hackney and the secrets at Christ Community Church.
Last time, things were getting pretty intense, trying to figure out if Nick was behind his wife's death.
So much was riding on the investigation. A fire that looked like an accident, a community that was divided, and a suspect who seemed, I don't know, untouchable.
A lot of layers to peel back, for sure.
So how did investigators finally uncover what really happened? Was there a big aha moment?
It was more like a combination of things. Good old-fashioned detective work, and, believe it or not, Nick's own missteps.
The pressure was getting to him.
Seems like it. As the investigation heated up, his carefully constructed facade started to crumble.
You can't hide forever.
No. He started giving conflicting statements to the police, contradicting his earlier story.
Trying to control the narrative, but messing it up in the process.
Exactly. But it was a physical piece of evidence that really turned the tide.
What was it?
A bottle of lighter fluid tucked away in the garage.
Lighter fluid. So that points to arson, right?
Remember how we talked about the fire starting in a strange spot under Dawn's side of the bed?
Yeah, I remember.
The lighter fluid suggested it wasn't an accident at all.
And with those inconsistencies in Nick's story.
Things weren't looking good for him.
So they finally had enough to arrest him.
They charged Nick Hackney with first-degree murder.
Wow, murder. The prosecution believed he set the fire to get rid of Dawn.
That was their argument. They said he wanted out of the marriage, wanted to be with these other women.
I imagine that rocked the church community.
It was a huge blow. Some people stood by Nick, couldn't believe he was capable of such a thing.
They thought the whole thing was made up.
They saw it as an attack on their faith, their community.
Others, though, must have felt betrayed, disillusioned.
Heartbroken, confused, trying to understand how the man they knew could do something so terrible.
Denial is a powerful force, especially when it comes to faith.
Absolutely. But in the end, it all came down to the trial.
What happened? Did the evidence hold up?
The trial was a big deal, all over the news. Nick's affairs, his manipulations, the fire. It was a media frenzy.
The prosecution? Did they make a good case?
They presented a lot of evidence, built a narrative of motive and opportunity.
What about the defense?
Yeah.
How did they try to defend Nick?
They tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case, said the lighter fluid could have been planted, that there was no direct proof Nick started the fire.
They played up the grieving husband angle, I bet.
Oh, yeah. They argued that the stress, the grief, it made Nick confused, that he was innocent.
So it was a classic he said, she said kind of situation?
It came down to which story was more believable, whose version of the truth the jury would accept.
What did the jury decide? Did they buy the prosecution's story?
After days of going over the evidence, they came back with a verdict. Guilty.
Guilty of murder.
First-degree murder. Nick Hackney was sentenced to life in prison, no chance of parole.
From youth pastor to a life behind bars, it's a stark reminder that actions have consequences.
No matter how much you try to hide the truth, it has a way of coming out.
This whole deep dive has been a journey, a look into the dark side of human nature.
We've seen the damage that unchecked power can do, how faith can be twisted, how lies can shatter lives.
It really makes you think, makes you question things.
Exactly. How can we recognize manipulation? How can we stay true to our faith while still being cautious, discerning?
It's a balancing act, that's for sure.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you something to think about, something to discuss.